Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sandra Morgan, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program, the fourth in our series entitled Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. This time, we'll be discussing the economic cost of war. Over the past 7 weeks, various faculty members from across the Kent State University community have shared their expertise and their knowledge of this historic and unfortunate event that is unfolding in real time. To date, we've discussed most aspects of this invasion, including the personal impact on the citizens of Ukraine, the cost of war, and now today, the economic impact of this war on the global economy. Before I turn over the program to my co-moderator for the evening, Dr. Felix Kumah-Abiwu, professor in the Department of Africana Studies, I'd like to remind you, once again, that your microphones are muted, but not your voices. We look forward to an excellent conversation between you and our guests and your insightful questions. After the discussion, I will present your questions and provide plenty of time for your responses. As a reminder, to ask a question, please select the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type it there. You may also join the conversation in the chat section. As always, we ask that your questions be courteous, productive, and on topic. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's program co-moderator, Dr. Felix Kumah-Abiwu. Felix?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Sandra. It's an honor and privilege to be here and to be part of this great panel. As my co-moderator, Sandra said, the world is going through such a very serious crisis now, with global, challenge to the security architecture that we know it used to be. So many of us are watching, live on television what is going on in Ukraine, and myself and many of us, and asking all those questions. What is going on with the globe in terms of our security, the global security architecture that was established after the Second World War? We are also asking a question: what can we do as a people? So we have explored all these things in the past, looking at the various aspects, the political aspects, and looking at the security aspect. So today we just want to go into the economic aspect. I always say that politics and economics affect each and every one of us. So the goal is, what is the implication of the war on us here in the North, in the global North, and of course, also in the global South. So that's where the perspective of the African aspect comes into the picture here, and I'm grateful that today we're going to be talking about that. So it's an honor and privilege for me to have guests today. Aspect, I always say that it's always good to hear what is going on the news, but it's always good to get an aspect, aspect to what is happening. So I'm going to introduce our discussants. I'm also happen to be one, but I'll go ahead and introduce our first discussant, Dr. Kathryn Wilson. She's currently the chair of the Department of Economics and also professor in the Department of Economics. She previously served as interim dean and then interim associate dean in the College of Business. She obtained her B.A. from Trinity College, of course, in economics, and also MS in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also her Ph.D., of course, in economics from the University of Wisconsin. And I must say and congratulate my colleague, Dr. Wilson. She's been here at Kent State for 26 years. And thanks for your service to Kent State. We're looking forward to hearing from you today and your expertise that you share with our audience. Her research area include public finance, economics of poverty, principles of micro and macroeconomics. Then our next guest, Dr. Andrew Barnes, is currently the director of the International Relations Program and also the undergraduate coordinator of the School of Multidisciplinary Social Science and Humanities. He obtained his BA in government at College of William and Mary His M.A. in politics from Princeton University, also his Ph.D. in politics from Princeton University. His research interest area is broad and also relevant to the topic that we are going to be discussing today. He focuses mainly on post-communist political economies, the politics of international finance and oil, links between markets and democracy. So it's an honor and privilege to welcome our two discussants. And the interesting aspect, I'm also joining not only as a co-moderator, but I'm also going to share the perspective from Africa and the Middle East. So I've been introduced already, but as you can tell, I'm originally from Ghana. I grew up there, had my B.A. in political science from the University of Ghana. I also had my M.A. In international relations and diplomacy from the University of Ghana. And I came to the United States almost 18 years ago. I was in Ohio University. I had another M.A. there in international development, and I went to Morgantown, West Virginia University, where I obtained my Ph.D. in political science. I taught in Eastern Illinois for about 3 years before coming to Kent State. So I have been at Kent for 7 years now. I'm the young one here. So it's an honor and privilege, again, that I'm part of this panel, that we can explore the ideas and dive into what is at stake today. So on that note, I will want all of us virtually to welcome Dr. Kathryn Wilson, who is going to be our first presenter to present to us today. So thank you very much. Kathryn, over to you.
All right, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to share my screen so that I do have some slides that I'll be sharing as I go along. But it really is a delight to be here, even though it is obviously a very somber subject to be discussing. So a little bit of what I'm going to be doing in my presentation is I'm going to do a little bit of an overview on the Ukrainian and Russian economy, focusing on two things that I think are particularly important to know to understand what will come next. And then I really want to focus on what have been the economic effects of the war. We're going to start in Ukraine and then kind of move out from there to Russia, Europe and Central Asia, the United States, and then a little bit on the world. So when we think about the overview of the Ukrainian and Russian economy, the two things I really want to drive home that I think are really important for context are the role of agriculture and the role of energy. So in terms of the role of agriculture, if you think about the land mass of the country of Ukraine, about more than 2/3 of the land in Ukraine is farmland. Agriculture is a huge part of their economy. In fact, agriculture was the main export, accounting for about 10% of their gross domestic product was agriculture that they exported out to other parts of the world. If you take Russia and Ukraine combined, together they supply about 1/4 of the world's exports in wheat. And some countries are particularly dependent on Ukraine and Russia for wheat. For example, in the Middle East and in Africa, they'll get more than 3/4 of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So agriculture, big part of the economy. Then on the energy, particularly coming from Russia, energy is a big part of the Russian economy. So a couple of things for context. They're the second largest producer of natural gas in the world. The United States is the largest producer of natural gas. Russia is second. And they're the third largest producer of crude oil in the world. About 1/8 of the world's oil comes from Russia. Similar to how the food was distributed differently in different areas, when we think about the energy, it's the same kind of thing. About half of Europe's natural gas and about 1/4 of Europe's oil imports come directly from Russia. Now, in thinking about natural gas and oil, there's one big distinction between them that is important for what some of these implications will be. Natural gas is fairly transportable. It can be shipped in tankers, so gas that's produced in Russia truly could be used anywhere in the world. I'm sorry, oil. Oil produced in Russia could truly be used anywhere in the world. Natural gas, with a few exceptions of liquefied natural gas goes through pipelines. And so really you can have trade in natural gas only if you have the pipelines connecting one country to another country. And so we think of oil as a global market. For the natural gas, there might be more regional markets for natural gas. So agriculture, energy, two huge parts of the economy in Ukraine and Russia. A couple other products that are really important, fertilizer. Russia exports about 15 to 20% of the world's fertilizer. And we've seen fertilizer prices go up by about 50% since the war. Aluminum, metals used in semiconductor chips. So there are other parts where it will play in, but these two are what we're going to mainly see ripple effects through. So let's think then about what are the economic effects of war. And like I said, I'm going to start with Ukraine. So imagine that this map represents the size of the Ukrainian economy in 2021. The World Bank predicts that the size of the Ukrainian economy in 2022 will be this much smaller flag, basically about a 45% fall in GDP. You can think of that as almost half of the Ukrainian economy is going to be wiped out this year compared to what they had last year. When we think about what that looks like, obviously we have a large disruption of people. More than 4 million people have fled Ukraine to other countries. We expect more in the coming months. An additional 6.5 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. So they're still in Ukraine, but they're not in their home cities. And that ends up affecting all aspects of the Ukrainian economy when you have that many people being displaced. Also, interesting to me to think in terms of the children. So more than half of Ukrainian children have been displaced. About 2 million have left the country as refugees, the others displaced within the country. And so you can imagine the disruption that has to education and some of the long run consequences that may have for the Ukrainian economy. When we think about this 45% fall in GDP, obviously it imposes a huge cost on people. About a third of the population is estimated to require humanitarian assistance right at this moment, that they're in dire need at this moment. And the World Bank, I'll throw a couple different poverty numbers around as I'm talking, because they use different measures for different parts of the world they're talking about. But one of the measures they use is $5.50 a day. So about $2,000 a year, which is the poverty measure they would use when thinking about Ukraine. I'm going to put a lot of numbers out there. I want you to pause and think especially about this one though. Last year, Ukraine's poverty rate using this measure was less than 2% of the population. So fewer than 2% of the population was in poverty this past year. This upcoming year, they estimate that it'll be 20% of the population. So about 1 out of every 5 people will be in poverty. And if it's a protracted war, we could see that increase to 30% or higher. Where the impacts are being felt are particularly, obviously it's widespread throughout. I wanted to mention a little bit about agriculture and infrastructure. So on the agriculture, talked about what a big part of their economy it is. It's had implications for the current as well as what we think of for the future economy. So for the current, the main way in which agricultural products were transported is they were shipped through the Black Sea. So about 90% of their grains were shipped out through the Black Sea. That mode, that transportation route has been cut off. So there's a lot of grain that's within Ukraine that they had planned on selling, but that they can't sell. And then if you think about it, it's springtime. Right now is when they would be planting the crops for the upcoming year. But you have workers who are no longer able to work because they are fighting. You have mines that have been placed in the agricultural fields, tractors, machinery destroyed. So where the areas of fighting is, we're not seeing planting at all. But even in the areas where we're not seeing the fighting within the country, there's still a lack of fuel, lack of fertilizer. Remember that fertilizer's prices going up 50%, lack of seeds. So throughout the country, we're seeing a big impact on agriculture that impacts it right now, but also will impact it throughout the coming year. And then lastly, on infrastructure. Estimates are between $200 and $500 billion worth of damage to the infrastructure of Ukraine. That is many times larger than the size of their annual GDP that they would produce. The amount of devastation to roads, to hospitals, schools, bridges, and ports means it's not just this implication for the Ukraine economy right now, but it's going to be an implication that is going to be long lasting. So huge effects within Ukraine, not a surprise, but sobering to think of the magnitude of them. We think about the economic effects of the war in Russia. Similar, if you think of this as the size, this flag as the size of the Russian economy in 2021, estimates are this would be about the size in 2022. Not nearly as drastic of an effect as we see in Ukraine, but still about an 11% fall in GDP in the country of Russia this year compared to last year. There's a lot of factors that goes into this. Some of it is foreign firms have pulled out of the Russian market. More than 400 United States companies have withdrawn from Russia. The demand within Russia for products has gone down because there's been job losses, income losses, high rates of inflation, and supply disruptions. Some of the sanctions and bans on importing and exporting goods is impacting the Russian economy, and Andrew's going to talk more about the sanctions themselves, but that has had an impact. And some of these sanctions, for example, the sanction on selling high-tech goods to Russia, so things like software, semiconductors, avionics, that's impacting the Russian economy right now, but that also I would expect is going to have longer lasting impacts on the Russian economy. So this year, the economy in Russia expected to be about 11% smaller than it was last year. If we broaden this out to look more at the European and Central Asia, I'm going to start with the European Union area. So this is looking specifically at the countries of the EU. And the European Central Bank has, because of the war, lowered their estimate of the GDP by about 0.5 percentage point. They think the EU will grow by about 0.5 percentage point less than they would have. And their projections of what will happen for inflation is that the price of everything in EU will go up by about 2 percentage points compared to what they would have expected without the war. So that's going to obviously have an impact within the EU. I talked about that natural gas and how much Europe relies on Russia for the natural gas. Natural gas prices in Europe right now are about 5 to 6 times higher than they are in the United States. Again, can't ship it to a lot of other places. So we're seeing seeing EU take on that. The other thing for the European Union from an economic perspective is also the immediate economic impact of taking in more than 4 million people. And especially for Poland, for Hungary, for Moldova, for Romania, those countries that are seeing the biggest influx of refugees, that's where we're seeing also an economic impact. So if we take all of Europe, so not just the EU, but all of Europe and parts of Central Asia, so that would be things like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, include Ukraine and Russia, so kind of that broader European Central Asian region. Here's a way of quantifying the estimated effects of the war. Pre-war, it was expected that that region would have their GDP grow by about 3%. Now, the estimate is the GDP will shrink by about 4%. So if you think about it, the impact of the war is about a reduction of 7% of the economy of that broader region. By the way, a lot of the numbers that I'm giving through this part are coming from a paper that recently came out by the World Bank. And Sandra, I don't know if it'll be possible to maybe put a link to that in the chat if people want more. Otherwise, you can contact me to get more on the numbers. All right. Effect for the United States. So I don't know that anyone will be surprised to see the inflation image that shows up on here. This is one of the biggest ways in which it's affecting the US. We're seeing higher energy prices, and this is important. Even though we don't tend to import much oil from Russia, the fact that Russia's oil, the sanctions and the disruption means the world price of oil has gone up, which means we're paying more at the gas pump. We're also seeing higher food prices as a result of this. The gas and brake pedal, you might be wondering what's that about? It's actually not for the gas prices, although it wouldn't have been bad because that is where we're seeing an increased price. That's actually my little nod to Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve Bank. So I think when we think about the impact of inflation in the United States, it's important to think of it in the context of the US economy had a huge shock with COVID, big loss of jobs. But in terms of a recession, we recovered remarkably quickly from that. So big drop, but really a pretty fast recovery. And in some ways, maybe an overheated recovery. So even before the war in Ukraine, we saw that demand was outstripping supply. People wanted to buy more goods than we were able to get because of supply chain problems. And so we saw prices going up anyways. And so the Fed when prices start going up too fast, that means the economy is overheating. They want to start hitting the brakes. They want to pull money out of this money supply. They want to increase interest rates, because really what they're trying to do is slow down that demand, bring things a little bit more into equilibrium so that we don't have really high inflation. The higher energy and the higher food costs that we're seeing as a result of the war make that a much more delicate decision of how much to hit the brakes. So I think we're going to see the Feds hit the brakes a lot more than they would have if it weren't for the war. But you don't want to slam on the brakes so fast that you slow down the economy and send us into a recession. So I think part of it is we're seeing these higher prices, but we're also seeing a lot of uncertainty about what is the best course of action to take. Then when we think of the world globally, the OECD estimates that the whole global economy will be about 1% smaller, 1% less growth because of the war in Ukraine. May not seem like a big effect, but 1% of the world economy is a huge loss. Same thing we saw for the United States, that inflation, that shortages of goods, transportation routes disrupted, that'll be something that will impact. Then I think getting to what this really means, I mentioned there's different measures of poverty. When looking at poverty around the world for all countries, often what's used is a really low poverty line, $1.90 per day. So $700 a year as kind of that absolute poverty around the world. And estimates are from the OECD that we'll probably see about 40 million additional people around the world live in poverty, living on less than $700 a year this year than we would have because of the war. So wrapping it up, agriculture, energy, those are the two most affected sectors of the economy. We're seeing that in all these areas that we're looking at. Doesn't mean that there's not other sectors of the economy that might be impacted, but these are the two main drivers. The economics of the war, effects of the war are felt everywhere. Huge effects in Ukraine, almost half the GDP is last year. Very large effects in Russia, more than a 10% reduction in GDP. Europe, we're seeing a large effect, especially energy, that natural gas. United States, more moderate, but we have that inflation, we have that uncertainty for the Fed. And then for the world, again, a large impact, less growth, more inflation, higher poverty. So I look forward to hearing what my other panelists has to say and discussion that follows. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. That's a very insightful one. You've given us a lot to think about. I like the aspect of the agriculture, those two variables, and I think that's going to cut across, our discussion a lot as well. So thanks so much for giving us a lot to think about. I'm sure many of our audience will have questions and we'll give you the chance to provide further explanation. So we're going to move to our next speaker, Dr. Barnes. Are you ready? You can go for it now. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I guess I should check and make sure that folks can hear me. Is that all good? See me? Terrific. Thank you for the introduction, Felix. The earlier one you gave was very nice. Thanks also to the audience members for being here, sort of sticking it out as folks get Ukraine fatigue. It's good to see some people still interested in learning about this critical issue. I also want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for putting together this panel and the rest of this series. It's been important, and I've been glad to see that the college was willing to do it. So what I want to do during my time here is to talk about economics, mostly from the ground level human side of things. What changes is the war bringing, and how are people and organizations reacting in order to continue to get what they need? Put another way, how do individuals get what they need and want? How do business owners as people and businesses as organizations adapt to new conditions? How do the rules of economic life change? And what does all of that come together to create? If there are students in the audience, I'll note that this is the approach I take in my course next semester called Worlds of Wealth and Power, and I'll put a link to that in the chat later. For this talk, I want to look at those processes first in Ukraine under fire, and then in Russia under sanctions. So with Ukraine, let's begin with the world of external refugees, the people who have fled the country in the face of the war. One thing to recognize here is the sheer size of this population and who they are. There seem to be about 4 million external refugees at this point, which is more than we saw in the first 3 years of civil war in Syria. Also, since most men have to stay in Ukraine, these are millions of families that have been separated, whether it's a son or a father or an uncle or somebody else who has stayed behind. The number of lives that have been completely uprooted is extraordinary. So what does this mean economically for all these people? Well, at the very least, they need access to food, clothing, and shelter, including for their children, for the foreseeable future. And so how do they get that? Well, one of the things that can happen is massive amounts of direct aid provided by governments and societies, whether that's NGOs or businesses or just individual people. And we've seen that in the last month and a half, especially in the countries bordering Ukraine, as we talked about a few minutes ago. Aid, though, can't cover everything, right? Not everyone can make it to a refugee center. They also need food, clothing, and shelter even before they get to those places. And almost nobody wants to stay in a refugee center forever. So what can they do outside of aid centers? That's actually a really tough question for a number of reasons that you can probably imagine, like the lack of familiarity with the area. Where do I buy stuff if I have money? The vulnerability to crime, right? That tends to follow large groups of folks flooding into a space. It's just harder to police, and simply not having a lot of money. When you leave a country in a hurry, you don't take a lot with you. So all of those are probably concerns that you might have thought about before. Another one that you might not have thought about before is the fact that the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, is not convertible in Europe under normal circumstances. Banks still inside Ukraine are providing services as best they can, which is remarkable in itself, but it's hard to use your Ukrainian savings in the rest of Europe, right? Vendors and banks are reluctant to take credit or debit cards from Ukrainian banks because they don't want to be paid in hryvnia because they don't know what to do with them. And people with Ukrainian cash can't convert that to Polish zloty, to euros, to British pounds, or whatever else in any normal way. So instead, they have to resort to informal mechanisms, like exchanging with what you might think of as currency sharks, who give terrible rates and then take the hryvnia by bus or truck back to Ukraine, to a bank that'll give them something for it, or to one of the few Balkan countries that will exchange them. A different option, which more and more people will probably turn to as time passes and their savings run out, is to look for work in a European country, right, and be paid in that currency. That, of course, will come with its own trials, including language barriers, a flood of other refugees looking for work, and potential pushback from local populations as they start seeing refugees not as somebody they want to help, but as competition for jobs. So all of those will be aspects of this process to keep an eye on going forward. All right, so that is the economic reality for Ukrainians who've been driven out of the country. How about for those still in Ukraine? I mean, 4 million refugees means there are still almost 40 million people in the country and under fire, with about 6 to 10 million of them internally displaced. What is their economic life like? Again, we need to think about how individuals acquire food, clothing, shelter, and so on, as well as how businesses and the overall economic structure continue to shift. In terms of survival and adaptation, it's interesting and sometimes inspiring to recognize that some stores are still stocked and open in areas that aren't under constant attack. And even in some that are, some businesses remain in operation. That means that supply chains, which frankly, a lot of folks never thought about before COVID, but that we all seem to understand now, or at least have a feel for, right? Supply chains are still functioning in some parts of the country. Some of the workers do get paid, some don't, but the patterns at least exist. Just adjusting to the realities of things like, unplanned road closures, to say the least. Facilitating that, and I have found this interesting since I found out about it, the Ukrainian media, which themselves are adapting by sharing resources, publish electronic maps of places that are still open, and they update them regularly. So it's pretty extraordinary to see, again, these sort of informal reactions to the necessities of life. Meanwhile, in places where people can't get to the grocery store or other places to get necessities, local networks have grown up. For example, I saw an interview with a bar owner in Kyiv who was using his bar not just as a place for people to sleep, but also as a place to collect food that he could distribute throughout the city. Almost a Meals on Wheels kind of operation that emerged quickly to help people survive. The Ukrainian government, for its part, which is still functioning, is doing what it can to facilitate the daily economic lives of people and businesses in these terrible conditions as well. For example, the central bank has put a moratorium on loan repayments, right? You don't have to make payments on any loan you owe, not just to the central bank, but to your credit card company, mortgage company, whatever. You don't have to make payments during the war, and you can't be hit with a late payment, or a late fee rather, for any payments that you missed during the war. Also, the federal government has dramatically reduced business taxes and basically made even those voluntary. The statement from the president, I think it was, if you can't pay, we won't ask any questions. So both of these decisions and others like them are pretty extraordinary examples of trying to work together to make life possible in hard times, but they also mean that lenders won't get repaid, at least in the short run. And the government, which is trying to fight a war, won't receive much tax revenue, at least in the short run. So it's going to be important to look for the long-term implications of those changes. Also, despite all of these efforts, a lot of people, of course, have lost their jobs, either because they've had to flee themselves or because the places that they worked were shut down. So here too, we're seeing adaptations. Some business owners in the eastern part of the country, for example, have picked up whatever inventory they could and moved their businesses toward the western part of the country. Right, so they're scrambling to find ways to restock their inventory, to stay connected with their employees, but it's not at all clear how many of them will survive as businesses. Meanwhile, individual people who've had to flee are facing similar issues to the external refugees, although without the issues of currency conversion. That is, they only have the possessions they brought with them and whatever savings they can access. So they're relying on strangers and relatives to help them in the short run. And in the medium and long term, they'll need permanent places to live and jobs to work at and earn money for what they need. So there are a lot of adaptations going on that are impressive and generally positive, given the crushing nature of the circumstances. But there are undoubtedly also uglier activities in progress, although they're not dominating the scene yet. One category of this type of adaptation is trafficking of things like weapons or drugs or people. Right, with security breakdowns, an influx of weapons, and an enormous number of displaced people, this kind of technically entrepreneurship almost always emerges in wartime. And a second category is profiteering, which is jacking up prices of things that are in high demand solely because of the war. For example, the mayor of Lviv a couple of weeks ago warned residents that price gouging on rent was a crime, which suggests that some people were trying to do exactly that, gouge people who were fleeing. So the first war profiteers are probably making their first piles of money right now. So far, their actions seem to be dwarfed by the better actions of their neighbors, but one of the sets of questions in a post-war society is what to do about any of that. So some of these underground businesses will try to continue after the war, like the traffickers. They may continue to try to operate. How and to what extent do you crack down? And some of these entrepreneurs will try to go legit after the war, maybe go into legal business once peacetime comes, but they're getting their start with dirty cash. What, if anything, do you do about that? And that's probably a good way to move into one more point about the post-war economic situation in Ukraine, whenever that comes. That is, there are already Western companies and Western government agencies thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine after the fighting is over. None of the contracts has been awarded yet, but I'd like to point out, so that we can all understand what's happening when it gets underway and the headlines are talking about it, that when governments and businesses talk about billions of dollars in aid going to Ukraine, most of what they mean, at least in the United States, is billions of dollars, and in Europe it would be euros, going to buy US-made products and to pay US workers to use those products in Ukraine to do things like build roads, schools, and hospitals, and to give advice on how to run their internal affairs. This isn't necessarily a horrible thing, but it's not handing several billion dollars to the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian businesses or Ukrainian citizens in order to buy what they need to rebuild their lives or their towns. And I just think that's something that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so that's a look at some of what's happening in economic life in Ukraine and among Ukrainian refugees. Now I want to say a few things about economic life in Russia, particularly in light of global sanctions. It's important to recognize that these are global responses to Russia's unprovoked and unnecessary invasion of Ukraine. All I want to do here is point out some of their effects and the adaptations that are underway. So first, there are the sanctions themselves. The list of them is enormous, as most of you know, and I'll put a link in the chat to a site that tries to keep track of them. It's really been an extraordinary response in its scope, in its speed, and in the unity of the West, broadly defined. And in addition to those formal sanctions, individual companies have been withdrawing or at least suspending operations temporarily. And the same link that I'm going to share also tracks that. Again, I feel like people sort of know that's going on. The question now is, what does it mean economically, particularly for individuals and so forth? Well, when you have sanctions, several things always happen, and they are happening in Russia. First, they hurt lots of people in lots of ways. So for example, the value of the Russian currency, the ruble, lost about 20% in the first days of the conflict. Some of that was because of the war and fears, and some of it then was because of the add-ons of sanctions. And what happens when your currency loses value versus other currencies is imported goods become more expensive. Now, lots of imports have been cut off anyway, but anything that has an imported component has increased in price overnight. Also, the disappearance of Western businesses means that Russians can't shop there anymore, and if they had jobs there, they no longer do. Also, Russian businesses that had any connection to the global economy will be damaged. They can't make international financial transfers, they can't borrow from international banks, some of their export and import activities have been cut off, and so forth. And so those businesses will eventually have to lay off workers. Then, next to those kinds of painful effects, you also see people making adjustments. And again, some might be good, some might be bad, but this is what's happening on the ground. For one thing, people buy less stuff since prices have gone up and there might be fewer goods available anyway. So they have less. For another, they make or grow things on their own. That is, they turn to subsistence production. And particularly in the springtime, I imagine there's a lot of garden growing to sort of supplement diets. Interestingly, in the slightly longer run, domestic businesses tend to fill in for formerly imported goods, right? So it'll actually benefit a few businesses that are able to take advantage of the disappearance of their competitors, and that'll be something to watch for after the war. But something else that happens is that people find ways to simply circumvent sanctions. Of course, it's the richer, more powerful folks who can do this more often. One thing they do is hide their money offshore, and another thing they do is import through Belarus or Georgia, which happened way back in 2014 when the first sanctions went into place. And so French cheese couldn't be bought in Russia, but all of a sudden Belarusian brie was found on shelves, right? So you find ways to circumvent the law if you're in positions of privilege. So some people would ask why you would engage in sanctions if they produce these nasty outcomes for so many people. The answer is that it's nobody's first choice. They're in place in hopes that they'll eventually change the behavior of the Russian government, and in particular, help push them out of Ukraine. One fairly direct way that this can work is by making it harder for the Russian government to prosecute the war, right? If they can't access their international reserves and can't borrow on international markets, they have less money for guns and soldiers. As the economy shrinks, they have less tax revenue for those purposes, and so on. Another more long-range hope is that sanctions will put political pressure on Putin to stop. It's not clear how fast that could work. People would first have to blame Putin and not the West, and then they'd have to drive him out of office or force him to change policy, which is hardly an easy task, but it would certainly make the Putin administration's life harder. All right, so this is how I often try to look at economic questions, studying the daily mechanics of how people, businesses, and others make it through the day, getting what they need and what they want. War disrupts that to an extraordinary extent, but people almost immediately have to find new ways to make it happen, or else they simply don't survive. So what we're seeing in the things I'm talking about here is what the survivors are doing by luck or by intent, and the new patterns that that's creating, which in turn will shape life after the war. I hope it helps us think about these and other events in a somewhat different way than we often hear about and read. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. You know, that important question which you asked earlier on as to how is life going on there? How are they surviving? How are they managing? Where do they have their money and all that? you have helped us to really think about and at least just, go into your presentation as giving us some insight into how things are going on there. And I like your concept that you have introduced there, that aspect of adaptation, which is a very central aspect to our human nature. I think, audience will have very good questions for you, which you can give us, updates and further, insight on that. So thank you so much for your presentation. So it looks like I'm wearing two hats, so I need to take off the other one now. So Sandra will take over and then just go ahead and present my own as well. Okay, so first of all, I just want to also thank the college for organizing this. I was at the third panel, which talks about the human cost, very, very, very great panel. And thanks to good colleagues who are also thinking about the continent, because as we all know, historically, the continent of Africa has always been marginalized when it comes to global affairs. I always tell my students, anytime there's a global event happening, you hear the news talking about, okay, let's interview global leaders. Let's see what others are, thinking about, and hardly would they interview any leader from the continent of Africa. So I'm glad and very excited that you have invited me, who works on Africa and also share the perspective of Africa, which is just going to be within the broader scale of what my other colleagues have talked about, because Africa is also in the globalized economy. We are also feeling the same price increases and all that. But just to give an idea, I'm going to talk about Russia, I'm going to talk about Ukraine, but to have a very good understanding or put it into context, I'm going to divide this talk into three parts. And I know the time is short, but I'll just go over that. So the central question, which I've been thinking about, for which is at the core of this presentation, is how is the war affecting Africa and Middle Eastern countries in terms of the economic cost, which is at the center of our discussion. Now, so going the historical aspect, Russia, of course, the Soviets at the time, during the Cold War era, which I'm not going to go deeper into the history, Russia has been engaged on the continent of Africa with the other, great powers of the time there. The global ideological war between the East and then the West, trying to woo other newly independent African countries that were, entering the global system. So during the Cold War era, the Soviets, of course, which was led by Russia at the time, and other countries were very, very much involved on the continent. And their engagement was strong. They were trying to, win many African countries to their part, as the US and their allies, the Western world, is also trying to steer them away. So you had proxy wars and others which were going on in many parts of the continent. Now, the other aspect, which I know colleagues who went to Russia to study, because that was another way to win the support of Africans. Now, other scholars estimate that close to like over 50,000 Africans, study in Russia, in universities, Soviet universities, and all that. So fast forward, after the end of the Cold War, what happened? Soviet Union broke apart, Russia, the Federation itself, trying to organize their own economy. So more or less they disengaged from the continent of Africa. They were not active the way they used to be during the Cold War era. So this was also the beginning point where Ukraine, becoming an independent country, was also reaching out, to establish the diplomatic relation with many countries in Africa, trying to forge, an independent country for, of course, any independent country does. They want to reach out, establish diplomatic relations, trade, and all this. So that's the way Ukraine, after the end of the Cold War, was also very much involved. So that was in the 90s and all. Then the 2000s, emerged, which some scholars would describe as the Putin era. We know the Putin effect is having, that syndrome is creating a chaos for the global world today. In fact, there's this scholar, Peter Pham, he's done a work, very, very important work called Back to Africa, Russia's New African Engagement. He has talked about all these other scholars have also given explanation of why Russia is re-engaging, in the 2000 always the Putin era on the continent of Africa. Now, there are various explanations. One key, resources, Russia doesn't have, of course, it has oil and gas, but doesn't have all the resources. Africa is so rich in resources. That's the paradox. A great political scientist, Ali Mazuri, George Aite, great scholars have talked about the paradox of Africa. Africa is so rich in natural and human resources, but the continent is still poor. So this has engaged our attention as scholars for generations, in the post-colonial era, try to explain. So part of the key explanation that Russia needs resources, aluminum, manganese, mercury, and all that has also driven them to explore. Now, then of course, what we hear on the news and in the scholarly works and all that, Putin has telegraphed to the world what he really, wanted to do just to increase the influence of Russia, along across many parts of the world. So that's another explanation for its engagement on the continent. Then the other aspect, which also comes to, we're not going to talk about China today, China's influence, that's another whole panel that we have to discuss. That's, the African votes, the votes at the Security Council, many African, the 54 countries are independent, but in most cases, because of the shared colonial history, they sometimes vote, en bloc in a way, not necessarily whole. You have few. So Russia, like other great powers, always want to use diplomatic means to court other countries. So when it comes to supporting resolutions at the UN, they will get their vote. So as you can see, the resolution which was introduced at the UN after the invasion, it's so interesting how the voting pattern of many African countries, went. It was just surprising because just like half that votes in favor to support Ukraine, other African countries either abstain or were absent. So that really explains, that brings us that question. So has Putin been successful in cutting many African countries or dividing the coherent way the many African countries will look at this, the invasion issue and all that. So the next question which I ask myself is, so how did he do this? How did he do this? One of the ways was to increase peacekeeping efforts across the continent. The interesting aspect is, which is so the combination of Putin's effort to really have greater influence on the continent came in 2019, not too long ago, when he held the first ever summit for African leaders. So that really just shows a lot of how that influence has really impacted on the continent. So coming down to the question of how they work. So because of this, and of course I talk about Russia and then the Ukraine. Ukraine also had close relations with many other countries, but not really. Ukraine has only about 10 embassies on the continent of Africa, so the presence is not so much felt. But so the question is, how is the war affecting many countries on the continent of Africa? Just like my colleagues discussed, the global effect is just astronomical. The commodity price, the surging prices, the food prices. We're going to talk more about that. As Kari, explained earlier on, Ukraine and Russia produce a lot of wheat, and many countries, especially the northern part of Africa, the Maghreb, then Middle East, bread is a staple, commodity there. Bread is consumed a lot. So if you think about that, the price of wheat is just going up, and of course, bread is the main ingredient used for that. So I look at some statistics which suggest that both countries, Ukraine and Russia, account for about 27%, of course, which global wheat export. When it comes to the continent of Africa, close to like 4 billion African countries imported agricultural products from both. Russia alone was 4 billion in 2020. That's a lot. It's a lot of when you put that in a broader context, and close to about 90% of the wheat, not only wheat, but you have, soya, sunflower oil, and seed is also heavily, and many African countries consume a lot of oil for their cooking and all that. So putting together, that's a huge aspect of it. So based on the volatility of the global market now, and then that effect on many countries in Africa, you can imagine the devastating effect which is having. When it comes to Ukraine, is not so much. They have the exports, Ukraine and many countries in Africa, about 2.9 billion, excuse me. That was in 2020. So the part which I'm going to, just run it up and then, just open it up for more when you get to the more so I can explain. But the part which I want to focus more on is the food security aspect, which, as you know, many countries on the continent already, we know very well endowed, it's widespread poverty and all that. So if there's importation, a huge importation, especially when it comes to Egypt, and because of the war, the effects on the price of wheat and of course gas, it's just raising concern amongst scholars and all that, because it's not only about the challenge for many finding it difficult to afford the aspect of access to afford, but there's going to be a longer political implications, because if you are not careful, people are hungry, there's a likelihood that there will be unrest. So those are the dimensions which we can think through this and say, wow, this war that is going on is not only affecting the region of Europe, but it's just global and on the continent of Africa. In Egypt in particular, which many observers are paying close attention to, because the price of wheat has just gone so astronomical, just high, that just unimaginable. So I want to just talk about Egypt briefly and talk about Lebanon, and then West Africa, East Africa, and then I will conclude my talk. So as I mentioned, Egypt alone, import like close to 80% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And as you know, many of their bread, some have been subsidized, but the unsubsidized one, as the literature suggests, has jumped within the last few weeks to about 25%. That's a very high, increase. And I was reading a piece where it's a very interesting, but it's the fact where it talks about, because of the way bread is so consumed in Egypt, it is just like in Egypt, a meal isn't complete without a bread. Of course, bread is always going to be part of that. So you could see that's a staple food. So if the prices are going up because of this war, you can imagine the consequences that is going to have on that country, and the political implications and all that. And not only Egypt, other countries like Tunisia, Morocco, they share the same culture, the Arab culture, and then they also heavily depend on wheat. Now, Lebanon has been going through a lot of economic challenges already, which, if you're not aware of, has been very high within the last couple of years, COVID and other aspects. And then I read when I was preparing for this, where the country indicated that the reserve for wheat is just going to last for only 1 month. Why? Because they also buy like 60% of their wheat from Ukraine, and because of the war, they are not able to meet those demands. So again, the food security aspect, where the effect on the ordinary people of the region, Middle East and Africa, and then the broader implications, which is likely to affect the whole economy, is something that we really have to pay attention to, and know that Africa is also not left out from the effects of the war. Another country which I want to briefly talk about is Yemen. Yemen, has been engulfed in a war for some time. So they've also been going through that crisis. They also import like 27% of their wheat from Ukraine, 8% from Russia. So they also been affected. So broadly, the food security aspect is a concern for many. But when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, Kenya in particular, they are concerned more about their wheat because Russia, not wheat, excuse me, their tea. They produce a lot of tea. We all love to drink tea. They produce a lot of tea, and Russia is among the top 5 countries that import from them. So the result of the sanctions and other implications, and they also import kind of substantial amount of crude oil from there as well. So that's also a concern across the continent of Africa that many experts are paying close attention to. So I want to run up with, I know my time is almost up, West Africa. West Africa, they also import, wheat, sunflower oil and the seed from there, but it's not so large. The aspect which my colleague talked about earlier on is the fertilizer. They also import a lot of fertilizer from the region, which is engulfed in the war now. So on the whole, the question of access, the question of high price, the implication of the COVID that we are dealing with already, and then the aspect of food security, and of course oil and the prices of gas and all that is also affecting the continent of Africa. And I'll end by saying, I don't want to end, not necessarily African countries are going to benefit from this, but we also need to understand and know that high oil producing countries like Angola and Nigeria, there's a likelihood that they might benefit from this because of the sanction on Russia and all that. So, and again, I want to underscore the fact that Africa is also really within a global domain and having an impact of the war in Russia and Ukraine, of course, Russia's invasion. So we have to find a way to stop Putin anyway, which we can. He's creating such a mess for the world, but we'll get there. I don't want to, go into a value judgment now. We are scholars, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers this evening. I have learned such an incredible amount just listening to you all. And I know that members of our audience have learned a lot too. I see that there are a couple of comments. First of all, you are being congratulated for making brilliant presentations. And I agree wholeheartedly. It was just fantastic. And I have a question here. I will remind everyone that they can share their questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. I do have some questions here, and I have one question in the chat, which is, where will the billions, the hundreds of billions of dollars come from for the rebuilding of Ukraine after the war? Will it come from the victor if Russia takes over? Is that a Pyrrhic victory of sorts for Russia? If Ukraine is victorious, will there likely be reparations from Russia? Does Russia end up paying for recovery either way?
Kathy, I saw you nod. I don't know if you want to start. Or was that
Sure,
not
in thinking this? I would love for you to kick this one off.
Okay, so yeah, I saw that question come in, so I wrote a couple of things down. I think it touches on a lot of interesting points. The first is, what would a Russian victory even look like? So you'd have to imagine who could surrender to Russia. An elected government in Ukraine probably couldn't surrender, right? So they would have to come in and impose a puppet government who signed some paper that looked like a surrender, right? So the whole, even Russia winning in some formal way would take some finagling, which would be interesting to think through. And either way, whether they got a formal signature or not, they would fight a guerrilla war, almost certainly, like the Americans did in Iraq, right? You'd have a population that is motivated and armed and doesn't want you there. So you'd be engaged in some of that. You could, and probably would, as the Russian government, nonetheless engage in some infrastructure projects, which, yes, would mean that Russia, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, Russia is paying, right? Russian tax money would be paying for something. What they'd be doing, though, is sort of the flip side of what I talked about in the West. They'd be paying Russian companies to come in and build X, Y, and Z. And in the Putin regime, what that would mean is connected oligarchs. So this would be a way to reward cronies who'd been supporting the Putin administration's war. I'm not confident that it would be particularly effective development for the rebuilding of sort of the citizen level economy in the country. You'd see big bridges or military bases or things like that that these oligarchs would be engaged in. Or you'd be able to take over the banks because you'd wipe out all the Ukrainian banks and sell them to Alpha Bank or whatever. So if Russia gets pushed out, though, then what happens? It will be what I was talking about, which is Western governments giving money to Western companies, but also the Ukrainian government, whichever Ukrainian government follows, giving money to Ukrainian companies, right? And so that's where it will come from. The question about reparations, I think the answer is it would take forever, if not longer, to get Russia to pay those. I'm not sure how you would enforce that. So mostly it would be Ukrainian funds to the extent possible, and then a huge influx from the outside, a lot of which would go to, like I said, to Western pockets.
Thank you for that. Another question is whether or not this is an opportunity for US and other companies or countries to sell grain into Africa. So in other words, if there is a void, from Ukraine and Russia, and seeing this question, looked up a little bit of data here, and Russia sells approximately $3.5 billion in wheat into Africa, followed by France at $2.2 billion, Ukraine at $1.5 billion, Canada, and then rounded out top five with the US at $743 million. Is this an opportunity for other countries to fill that void?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It is. Let me start this way. Many policy experts and scholars have been, I don't want to use the word warning per se, but just trying to let the US, which has been a major partner of Africa and Europe for a long period of time, we know they've been engaged after the 9/11 era, but it was a secretized development issue. So by a certain point, that support has just been kind of waning. So now China, and of course, Russia, which I explained to you earlier, seems to take the leading role, and as you said, Russia is still the leading arm sales to many part of Africa. And again, they always say it takes two to tango. The other way, many African countries, which are not very open society. You have dictators and others which really like the authoritarian type. So China is coming, Russia is coming, they are not imposing conditionalities for loan and all that. So that has also attracted them, So what is happening now, and as an African and a scholar of the continent, when I look at the UN vote, it's just so surprising because this is the point where we felt like it should be all the countries support the West to punish Russia for this aggression. By the way, Africa is virtually divided. So I think this is a very important time for the US to put in strategies to re-engage actively with the continent, in terms of of course, trade is going on already, issues of human rights, issues of development, Europe. And so, yeah, I think it's a new era where there is going to be an opportunity for Africa and the West to re-engage it. And I must also end, which I always share with, whether it's in a forum of policy makers and all that, the whole partnership has always been a top-down approach. So many African governments and ordinary Africans also want to point out, okay, we want a partnership which is supposed to be based on equal basis, respectful way. Should not be this top-down approach where you are always asked to do this or asked to do this, or plans are designed in Washington and then impose. So Africans are also conscious about this, that, okay, we want a mutual partnership, respectful partnership that will grow strong into the future. So yeah, I agree. It's an opportune time for re-engagement with the continent.
Thank you for that. And so kind of to follow up on that, there's a question of what role the US can play in easing food security in Africa and the Middle East. And I guess my question on that would be, would this be philanthropy or would this be, business sales?
I think it may have to do more with the USAID. I know USAID has been very involved with that. Okay, so extreme areas. I think what Africa may need now, especially just to identify areas which are really into crisis mode, food security crisis, where USAID could come in to support. But there are majority of African countries who they are really, I wouldn't like to say self-sufficient per se, but just the prices, they are dealing with the high prices now. They can, the products are there, but it's going to be very expensive for them because already incomes are low, But that is not to suggest there are other places that will really need help, places where food insecurity is, or food is really dire need, these people really need. So USAID could come into that. I know of other development agencies and of course, business, partners. But yeah, my simple answer is the US government always take the lead, on these kind of issues.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Stated, we have already seen discussions about how the economic impacts of COVID may have encouraged processes of deglobalization. Will the Ukrainian crisis further exacerbate this trend?
I'll jump in on that one a little bit, because I do think this is something that I'm really curious to see of how much, is this a bit of a pivot point around that? I think the answer may vary depending on where we're looking at. For Russia and potentially for China, as they also think of what might be some implications, there may be a tendency to start putting those walls up a little bit more, because to make it so that they are not as susceptible to things like sanctions. I think if that happens long term, we'll see that to their detriment as well as to the detriment of others. I wonder a little bit if it'll be a deglobalization or if it'll be a diversification of globalization, so that we can't rely on one or two areas, but instead we have a lot of areas that we're relying on for different products. But I do think that COVID and then throwing this on top of it, that it causes a reconsideration around how interconnected different countries might want to be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I am looking to see if there's anything else in the chat. Here's another question. China has been mysteriously quiet. Where are they in the mix?
So we have a panel with nobody who's an expert on China. We'll just say that. China is trying to delay making decisions as long as it can, right? The best way forward is to not mess anything up for China. If it turns out that Russia emerges dominant from this, China can work with that. If it turns out that Russia emerges diminished from this, China can work with that. India is playing a similar game at the moment, it appears. Both of those are incredibly large economies in terms of the number of people in them, and in China in terms of just the actual economic size of the economy. And so the rest of the world watches them in certain ways too, like, well, we got to see what China's going to do, what India's going to do, because when that happens, it'll have big impacts. So they're in positions to delay, and that seems to be the game that they're playing right now.
I would agree with that, particularly on the the demonstrative public stage. The one area where both China and India are doing some that does have an impact is they are buying up some of this energy products, the natural gas and the oil at a discount. So they're buying, if you think about those pipelines and such, they're able to buy some of that directly from Russia at a discount, which helps them out because they're getting these products for cheaper, but also helps Russia out. And I don't know that they're doing it to the extent that the rest of the world is up in arms about it yet, but I do think that what happens on that front certainly impacts how much teeth some of our sanctions have.
I think that's absolutely true. We talked about sanctions and avoiding them before, and there are always leaks, and this is absolutely one of them. And the American company Shell tried to do the same thing on the way out of Russia, right? Buy a load of oil that was way lower than you would have expected the price to be simply because of the war. And they got hammered for it. It's still not clear whether they actually gave that to Ukrainian refugees like they promised, but whatever. But so all actors will do that. One of the things to sort of take it to another level is to think about, sorry, we say India bought it, we say China bought it. When Shell bought it, was that the United States buying it? Or is it companies? Are people making profits, or are these governments getting tax dollars? Or is, this sort of how that all plays out will also be interesting to watch. But the point is absolutely correct.
I was going to say something about, this war, Russia invasion of Ukraine has kept me thinking a lot. Going back to my own graduate days in my IR class, talking about the concept of the security dilemma, the responsibility to protect, the R2P concept that emerged in the 90s and others, the Luanda case, Kofi Annan and all this. So it's just like, let's imagine if we're to be a middle level power or a small power doing this to another country. The major nuclear powers are going to find a way to intervene quickly, to protect, responsibility to protect. When it's mass, watching human suffering every day. But it looks like the world is helpless. It's just like, because we are dealing with a so-called nuclear power, China is quiet. India, nuclear power. So the point is that when the big powers who are supposed to maintain global peace and stability are now engaged in a war, we are helpless. That's the way, because that's the way, that's what I was thinking about this. So we are kind of in a new territory now, where we just what helpless. The security architecture that were established, NATO, just like, everybody feel like, can somebody just go out there and help Ukraine and protect civilians who are just dying off every day before our eyes? But again, the aspect of what do we do when we provoke a nuclear power? So the dynamics of the international system now, that's where, I was having a conversation with a colleague the last time. Many African countries, South Africa and Nigeria, has been fighting for a seat on the Security Council many years. I had the president of Ukraine made a suggestion that maybe this is the time to dissolve the Security Council so it can be reformed because of the position of Russia. So China is just quiet. China is not playing that leading responsible role that everyone expects of China. And Putin is just doing things with impunity. So that's what worries me. And I try to explain this, bring this to the discussion of my students. They express this. So what is going on with all these organizations, the institutions that are supposed to protect, just like they seems powerless, because of a so-called nuclear power that cannot be touched. So if this is the path, then it might look pessimistic, but I'm always hopeful something will change for the better. So yeah, China is not playing the role that we expect China to do. Yeah.
Any comments or responses?
I mean, I think that's interesting because it also has a flip side, and I don't like to always flip the tables or whatever, but sometimes it's useful that. So in some sense, yes, the responses to Russia are limited, the direct responses to, right? If Iraq had done this to Kuwait, for example, we know what would have happened. We saw what happened. There was an invasion from the outside. On the other hand, when Saudi Arabia does it to Yemen, nobody moves. And that's actually more common in some ways, is that conflicts among smaller countries are looked at by the big countries as, well, those are just, I don't know, wild folks who don't get along and we have no part in it. So one of the interesting things to me about the reaction to the invasion of Ukraine was how quickly the West did unite and come down with sanctions we've never seen before, including a sitting president, including a central bank and its assets, right? It's not just business stuff. It's targeted in ways that we've never seen before. And you see NATO moving stuff. Now they've decided, at least so far, to say we're not going to physically defend Ukraine, but we'll certainly send weapons. And as soon as you step foot in Poland, we'll come down on you hard. So by those characteristics, it's a more radical reaction to this than we've seen in some other places. But you point out that by some other measures, right, that like actually driving them out versus what we were able to do against Saddam Hussein, it's a lesser reaction because of Russia's nuclear capabilities. And so, yeah, your point that the global security architecture might need a revision is certainly something I would be interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
Well, that being said, I don't see any other questions. And so is there anyone who'd like to make some final statements? Don't all jump at once now.
Okay, yeah, I can start. Again, I just want to, first of all, thank my fellow panelists. I think we can just talk and debate this issue. I've really learned a lot myself, and I want to, I think we are in a very uncharted territory now. And as you know, I mentioned earlier, I just want to underscore the fact that every part of the world, including the continent of Africa, is also feeling the heat economic-wise from this war. And it is my expectation that anyway I can do as a scholar of the continent, that we need a united voice, strong platform. And if that's supposed to come from African government, 54, to put pressure, and Russia know that no, you are encroaching on the territorial integrity of the country, which will not be accepted. That united voice from the African Union and other African countries will go a long way to send a signal to Putin that, no, I'm not going to divide the continent. As my colleague Andrew said, Europe and the US and the Western world they have their own divisions, but this conflict has united them so strongly, which is not in the best interest of Putin. He doesn't want to see that. He wants a divided NATO or EU. The same way, my expectation is that Africa and many countries in Africa and the AU, the African Union, countries can come with that common voice to speak to this aggression, against this aggression. But that is not happening now. But anyway, it is my hope that that will change soon. I just want to leave with the audience that, yeah, Africa is also part of the global environment. It should not be put at the periphery when it comes to global affairs. The same way we are feeling the increasing the cost and all that is also happening on the continent. So I'm hopeful for the future, a better future for the world. Thank you.
Kathy, I don't know, I'm happy to go, but all right. Reverse order of how we presented, good. So I wanted to thank everyone too. I have learned a great deal myself as well, and really appreciate the time that was put into the panel. I wanted to leave folks with two thoughts about how we can make a difference on the ground, right? Turning back to my focus of life on the ground. First is to donate. There are lots and lots and lots of groups out there who are trying to help, and they need us. Sometimes my tendency is to look for the perfect place. There's no perfect place. Your donation is not going to solve the problem, but your decision not to donate is going to contribute to it. So find a place and give some, and then a week later, maybe find some other place and give some. So I encourage folks to donate where they think they can afford to do so. Second, remember that we live in communities where there are a lot of people with ties to the region, whether they're first generation from Ukraine or Russia, or they have grandparents there or whatever. If you run into folks like that, just ask them how they're doing. Ask them what they need. Go have coffee with them, whatever. It depends on what your relationship is with them, of course, but ask what they need and see what you can do to help out folks here who are affected by it, not just sort of refugees on the ground there, for example. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, everybody.
Oh no, Andrew, you made me wish I would have gone before you, because that would have been a great spot to end instead of me, as I think those are great comments. I think for me, a couple of things that I think of as just parting. One is just a recognition of how global the economy is. And we've seen that in terms of ripple effects of what happens in Ukraine, obviously affecting Ukraine, Russia, but truly throughout the world, and especially as Felix highlighted in the African continents, as well as United States and other areas. And so that interconnectedness, I think the second thing is, it's outside of my area of expertise, but that conversation near the end of how the United States and the West has responded differently to different situations around the world. I guess the part where it is in my wheelhouse as an economist is economics is about trying to understand decision-making, trying to understand incentives. And I think it's really interesting in those cases to think of what incentives might have played into the role the United States has taken, and as well as the West, and a recognition of when are things altruistic, when are things ultimately self-serving. And I think that line can get really blurry if we start thinking of we're doing all these things out of altruism, but maybe some of them, it's not coming from that as much. And so I think it's a fascinating conversation to have and to think about. And truly, I just want to thank the panel. I really enjoyed working with you on this. Thank you to Sandra, and this was a lot of fun. So thanks for letting the arts and sciences part of the economics department participate in this conversation, because we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to state that this was an absolutely wonderful conversation. I know I learned a great deal, and I'm certain that our audience did too. It was a lively conversation, and it really helps us, throughout this series to continue to put the issues at hand into perspective and try to make sense of it all on any number of levels. Thank you again. And on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, the panelists tonight, and our organizers, I'd like to say thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. And I hope you have a lovely evening. This is being videotaped, this conversation, and it will be available within the next few days. It will be posted on YouTube, on Facebook, and will be shared with all of the participants so that they can share among their networks as well. So again, thank you again, and we'll see you at the next one.